President, I'm here on the floor today to speak in support of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is the bipartisan legislation that's before the chamber. That will make historic investment in our nation's core infrastructure, and I'm pleased to follow my colleague and friend from Utah, Senator Romney, who was one of those who I worked with to help negotiate this package. This is historic legislation that provides $550 billion in new federal investments over the next 5 years to respond to the needs that are facing our country. This bill will rebuild crumbling roads and bridges and tunnels across the country. It will provide clean drinking water in American homes and address harmful contaminants. It will increase connectivity in our communities to bring broadband to even the most rural parts of our country. It will prioritize sustainable solutions to improve our infrastructure systems for future generations, and it will combat climate change by making the monumental investments in our clean energy grid and electric vehicle infrastructure that we must make. Now, this bill was a long time in the making, as I'm sure my colleague from Utah would agree. Over the past 3 months, there have been many late nights, early mornings, countless conversations about how to make the best use of this opportunity to invest in our nation's infrastructure. I very much appreciate the continued good faith negotiations from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle and the White House and the leadership of Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Rob Portman to deliver this bipartisan infrastructure agreement. I also appreciate the work of the chairs and ranking members of relevant Senate committees who laid the foundation for so much of the bipartisan work that has gone into this bill, as well as the leadership of both parties for giving us the space and time to get this agreement to the floor. Now, I could spend all day talking about the many aspects of this legislation that meaningfully invest in our communities and in our country. But today I want to specifically talk about two key areas that I worked on. Both of these issues, water and broadband, speak to the critical needs in New Hampshire and across the country. Water and wastewater infrastructure is one of the major investments we make in this bill, $55 billion invested in this area. Now, no parent should have to worry about the safety of their family's water when they turn on the tap. But unfortunately, as most of us know, this is not the case for too many Americans because compromised water supplies, due in part to our rundown water infrastructure, is an issue across this country and in some places in New Hampshire. This was a problem for decades before the pandemic hit, but looking at the crisis like COVID-19 has illustrated just how basic and essential clean and safe drinking water is for our communities. Righting this wrong starts with investing in our water systems, which have been severely underfunded for too long. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, drinking water utilities will need to invest $472.6 billion over the next 20 years in order to provide safe and sufficient drinking water to the American public. Well, fortunately, we have a big chunk of that as a down payment in this proposal. And earlier this year, the Senate passed overwhelmingly on a bipartisan vote the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act. That bill makes a historic investment in our water infrastructure through authorizations. And in addition to putting significant funding toward that effort, the bipartisan infrastructure package before us includes $15 billion to replace lead service lines, which is a huge public health priority, and it's an issue that's long plagued communities across this country. Another real public health concern that's addressed in this bill is the presence of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, in our water supplies. Preventing exposure, cleaning up contaminated sites, and understanding the full scope of the health implications associated with these chemicals is critical for so many affected by PFAS in their water. As I've heard again and again from New Hampshire families, discovering that you've been drinking contaminated water can produce a range of emotions from anger and fear to guilt. That's what I heard from so many parents who had children at the former Pease Air Force Base, where they were in child care and parents thought they were safe in those child care centers, but they found out that they'd been drinking water contaminated with PFAS. That contamination at the former Pease Air Force Base forced the city of Portsmouth to shut off 3 drinking water wells in 2014. The contamination was created by the use of firefighting foam by the Air Force when Pease was an Air Force base. One of those wells that was shut down, the Haven well, has just come back online this week after 7 years. It was inoperable for 7 years. PFAS contamination surrounding the St. Gobain manufacturing plant in Merrimack in New Hampshire and in areas around the Coakley landfill Superfund site in the Seacoast create an ongoing worry for Granite State families, also because of PFAS contamination. So you can imagine what those parents felt like when they found out their children had an elevated level of PFAS in their bloodstream, and they didn't really understand what that meant. I remember talking to one mother who told me she had taken her daughter to Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center for her health exam, and she talked to the doctor about the elevated levels of PFAS in her blood, and she said the doctor didn't know what I was talking about because this is an emerging contaminant. But thanks to the work of so many of those affected, people like Andrea Amico in Portsmouth, who helped found a group called Testing for Pease, and folks who were involved with the Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water. They have raised awareness and worked to find solutions to clean up our drinking water. We owe it to them, to all of those families affected by PFAS and contaminated water supplies, a serious commitment to stop this problem where it starts and to give them the peace of mind that they so deserve. The comprehensive measures to address our water infrastructure that are contained in this historic bill will help do just that. Now, water infrastructure is a serious issue that New Hampshire shares with many other states throughout the country. Like water, another shared issue is access to broadband, or high-speed internet service. The challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, just as they highlighted the challenge of not having enough access to clean water, highlighted just how important it is for our communities to have fast and reliable access to the internet. Whether we like it or not, we live in a digital world. We all relied on that digital world more than ever during the COVID crisis so that our kids could go to school, so our grandparents and our families could keep their medical appointments, so our businesses could stay afloat. Of course, even before the pandemic started, the digital divide created an equity issue that deepened disparities in education, health, and business. Now, if you live in a community in northern New Hampshire, how can you attract business to your community if you don't have access to high-speed internet, if the business can't open a website and tell people what they do? Just last month, I met with representatives from several towns in southwestern New Hampshire, another part of our state, where they've been struggling to bring high-speed internet service to their residents. Now, due to their rural nature, these towns and others like them are unable to attract a provider to work with them. About a quarter of those that live in these towns are considered unserved, and far more are underserved. At that session, I talked to a woman named Molly Miller. She's a telecommunications committee member from Hancock, New Hampshire, a town with about 1,600 residents. She talked about the challenges that her family had experienced trying to work and do school from home during the pandemic. She said everyone had to disconnect while her youngest son was participating in college classes. And she shared a story about her son. She said he was unable to turn in his final exam from one of his courses because the file was too large. He couldn't print it because they didn't have enough speed, download speed, in their house. By the time he made it to the library to print out the file, it was too late. His exam was not accepted. That's just the kind of everyday challenge that families who don't have access to high-speed internet face. And broadband access isn't a partisan priority. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle recognize the need for significant investments to ensure that all of our workers, our students, our families are able to connect to the critical resources that are provided by the internet. This infrastructure bill commits $65 billion to bring high-speed internet to communities in New Hampshire and all across the country. Madam President, these bold investments are what we need to create jobs, to enhance the safety of our infrastructure networks, and to improve this nation's competitiveness. Now, had I written the bill before us on my own, I'm sure like everyone in this chamber, it would have included different priorities than what's before us in some cases. But as we know, that's not how the give and take of negotiations work. It's not how compromise works. You give and you get. And the fact is that New Hampshire and the United States are going to get a whole lot in this infrastructure package. We also know that legislation that has broad bipartisan support stands a better chance at lasting longer without threats of being repealed or reversed. President Biden supports this package, and we've received strong support across the aisle through the procedural votes that we've had so far. I'm proud to have worked with my colleagues to help craft this bipartisan bill, and over the coming days, I know that I'll work with even more people in this chamber as we try and move this legislation through the Senate. Thank you. I look forward to a strong, positive vote by the end of this week, and I yield the floor.